Psychic Stocks. Belief Shapes Finance.
Welcome to another deep dive, and today we're going to be exploring this fascinating intersection of faith and finance.
Yeah.
And specifically looking at this question that I think a lot of Christians grapple with. How can we reconcile this pursuit of wealth, with the teachings of Jesus Christ, which are, seemingly selfless?
Right.
And I think that's a really interesting area because, we all as human beings have this desire for security. And it often manifests itself in finances and wanting to, be financially set.
Right.
But then, we have these teachings from Jesus that tell us to focus on, the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And to not worry about material possessions. And so how do we kind of balance those two?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating because, the question itself almost presupposes a tension, right? It kind of presupposes that there is this stark, either a choice you have to make between wealth and a Christ-like life.
Right.
But if we really kind of dig into Scripture, I think the picture becomes much more nuanced.
Right. It's not as black and white as some people make it out to be.
Exactly.
One of the verses that I think comes to mind often when discussing this is Matthew 6:19 and 20, where Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also."
Yeah.
So, this is a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
It seems to suggest that we shouldn't be focused on accumulating wealth at all.
Yeah, and that's a passage that often sparks a lot of debate, and I think rightly so. It's a very important passage to grapple with. But I think while it certainly cautions against prioritizing earthly possessions, I don't think it necessarily outright condemns wealth, right?
Yeah.
I think the emphasis, the real kind of thrust of that passage is on where our hearts lie. Are we, seeking fulfillment in material things, in, just that kind of accumulation, or are we really focused on our relationship with God and the treasures that we're storing up, in heaven?
I see your point, yeah. It's more about the motivation and the priority.
Exactly.
Not necessarily about the wealth itself.
Right.
And in fact, when you look at the Bible, there are many examples of individuals who were both wealthy and blessed by God.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Abraham,
Yes.
the father of faith.
Yes.
He was described in Genesis 13:2 as being very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And, his wealth was seen as a sign of God's blessing.
Yeah, and a testament to his faithfulness as well, right?
Right.
That's an important thing to remember. I think sometimes we think of wealth as this kind of like a reward for, doing good things or being a good person. But in Abraham's case, his wealth was there from the beginning. And it was really through his faith, through his obedience to God, that wealth was kind of like, blessed and multiplied.
Yeah. And then you have Job.
Yes.
Who, before all of his trials, was also described as one of the wealthiest men in the East.
Absolutely, yeah. Job 1:3, describes him as the greatest of all the people of the East, possessing just vast herds and flocks and servants.
Right.
And then, of course, you have King Solomon, who is renowned for his wisdom, but he was also incredibly wealthy.
Yes.
Right, the Bible talks about the massive amounts of gold and silver that he received as tribute, his extensive trading ventures.
Right, he was very wise in managing his finances.
Exactly.
And so these examples really seem to challenge this notion that wealth is inherently incompatible with faith.
Yeah.
It seems that the Bible's more concerned with how wealth is acquired and used
Precisely.
than the actual possession of it.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. The issue isn't wealth itself, it's our relationship with it. Are we seeking it for selfish gain? Are we consumed by it? Or are we viewing it as a resource that's entrusted to us by God?
Right.
To be used for his purposes.
Yeah, and so that kind of leads us to the question of, if we are trying to reconcile our faith with our, financial aspirations or financial security, what does a responsible approach to wealth accumulation look like?
That's the key question, right?
Yeah.
And I think for me, it really starts with this deep understanding of biblical stewardship,
Sure.
which is recognizing that everything we have, including our financial resources, ultimately belongs to God. Right? We're merely caretakers, entrusted with managing these resources for his glory and the good of others.
Right.
And so when we start with that premise, it shifts our perspective from one of just personal gain to one of responsibility and service.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's about using it for a purpose greater than yourself.
Exactly.
And this reminds me of the parable of the talents.
Yep.
Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30,
Yeah.
where you have this master who entrusts his servants with varying amounts of talents, which represent, resources or abilities.
Right.
And he commends those who invest wisely and multiply what they've been given, but he rebukes the servant who buries his talent out of fear.
Yeah. Powerful parable.
Yeah, I think it's a really good illustration of responsible stewardship.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It highlights this importance of not simply hoarding or squandering what we've been given, but actively seeking ways to grow and utilize it for a greater purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's this kind of misconception, I think, in some Christian circles that investing is akin to gambling,
Oh, yeah.
which is often, viewed as morally questionable.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we need to kind of address that head on. I think investing and gambling are fundamentally different activities, right?
Okay.
Gambling is based on chance, the desire for quick riches, often with little regard for the consequences. Investing, on the other hand, involves careful research, analysis, and a long-term perspective. It's about aligning your resources with companies or ventures that you believe will create value, that will contribute to the economy.
It's about making informed decisions, right?
Exactly.
Being a good steward
Yes.
of what you've been given.
And, you think about Proverbs 21:5 says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty."
Right.
And I think that verse really encapsulates the essence of responsible financial management. It's about diligence, it's about planning,
Right.
thinking ahead.
Not just kind of, taking a gamble or a shot in the dark,
Exactly.
but really thinking through your decisions.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, there are some churches that seem to almost discourage investing.
I've heard that too.
And instead they promote liquidity. They emphasize the need to have this readily available cash for charitable giving
Yeah.
or for unexpected expenses.
Right. Which those are good things, right? Generosity, preparedness.
Of course. Yeah.
Those are very important.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes that perspective, while well-intentioned,
Yeah.
can inadvertently limit individuals' financial potential.
Okay.
And by extension, their ability to be impactful. If you're constantly focused on just having cash on hand,
Yeah.
you might miss out on opportunities to grow that wealth and really make a difference in the world.
Right. You're not really being a good steward if you're just letting it sit there.
Exactly.
So it seems that there needs to be this balance
Absolutely. Yeah.
between short-term needs and long-term growth. And, that leads us to, I think, another important aspect of this whole idea of responsible wealth accrual is the ethical considerations.
Yes, absolutely.
How can we ensure that our pursuit of, financial well-being is aligned with these biblical principles of justice and compassion and integrity?
Right. That's a huge question.
Yeah.
And one that I think we need to spend some time unpacking.
Yeah. And that is a question that we will continue to explore further in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
We're going to kind of delve into some of the challenges of ethical investing.
Okay.
And we're going to be examining trends like moral screening and the rise of these Christian ETFs.
Interesting.
And so, we'll pick that up in the next part.
That's good.
Welcome back to our deep dive into this complex world of faith and finance.
Yeah.
In part one, we started to kind of explore this idea of responsible wealth accrual. And really kind of challenging ourselves to view finances not as these personal possessions, but as resources that are entrusted to us by God.
Right.
And, we talked about the example of Abraham and King Solomon,
Yes.
Individuals who had substantial wealth, but it didn't contradict their faithfulness. So as we kind of dig deeper into this idea of responsible wealth accrual,
Yeah.
we inevitably run into this question of ethical investing.
Absolutely.
How can we as Christians who are seeking to honor God with our finances,
Right.
how can we ensure that our investments align with our values and contribute to a more just and compassionate world?
Yeah. And I think that's a question that a lot of people are wrestling with these days, especially as we're navigating, an increasingly complex landscape of investment options.
Yeah.
It's not always easy to discern, what aligns with our faith and what might contradict it.
Right. And One trend that has emerged in recent years is this concept of moral screening,
Yes.
where investors will intentionally avoid certain companies or industries
Right.
that they perceive as conflicting with their values.
Yes, so this might involve excluding companies involved in activities like gambling, alcohol production, or the manufacture of weapons, for example.
It sounds like a very well-intentioned approach
Right.
to try and, align your investments with your moral compass. But I imagine it can be quite challenging to draw those lines.
Yeah, it definitely can be.
What about a company that produces both military and civilian products?
Right.
Or a pharmaceutical company that researches life-saving drugs but also manufactures contraceptives?
Exactly. Those are exactly the types of dilemmas that investors face when engaging in moral screening.
Yeah.
And it requires, careful discernment and a nuanced understanding of both the company's operations
Right.
and the potential impact of those operations. And even with thorough research, there's always, I think, a degree of subjectivity involved. Right? Because our values are subjective to a certain extent.
Right. And that leads us to another trend
Yeah.
in the Christian investment world. And that is the rise of these so-called Christian ETFs
Oh, yes.
or exchange-traded funds that are marketed as these morally sound investment options for believers.
Right.
But, as we've discussed earlier, these funds often prioritize companies that appeal to a specific demographic.
Yeah.
Usually aligning with conservative social values
Yeah.
rather than genuinely embodying Christ-like principles.
Right. It's more about kind of fitting into a particular, cultural or political mold
Yeah.
than it is about really reflecting the heart of the gospel.
And so, that raises some pretty important questions.
Absolutely.
Are these funds truly living up to their claims of being Christian?
Right.
Are they simply catering to a market niche?
Yeah.
Or are they genuinely committed to aligning investments with biblical values?
It's a good question.
It seems like there's a potential for these funds to mislead investors, especially those who might not have the time or expertise to scrutinize their holdings in detail.
Right.
So how can we avoid falling into this trap and make sure that our investments are truly aligned with our faith?
Well, I think diligent research is crucial.
Okay.
Right? Don't simply rely on labels or marketing materials.
Yeah.
Really dig into the specific holdings of these funds. Ask yourself if those companies genuinely reflect biblical values. Are they treating their employees fairly? Are they operating with integrity and transparency? Are they contributing to the common good? Or are they exploiting vulnerable communities for profit?
Right. And those are really important questions to ask.
Yeah.
And this reminds me of a verse from Proverbs 22:16.
Okay.
It says, "Whoever oppresses the poor to increase his own wealth or gives to the rich will only come to poverty."
Yeah. That's a powerful verse.
It seems to be a pretty strong warning
Yes.
against seeking financial gain at the expense of others.
Exactly. And I think that verse really speaks to the heart of ethical investing.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that our pursuit of wealth should never come at the cost of exploiting or harming others.
Yeah.
Right. We are called to be stewards of God's resources, and that includes using our financial influence to promote justice and compassion.
So, how can we move beyond simply avoiding harm and actually actively seek out investments that contribute to a more just and compassionate world?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it leads us to this concept of impact investing,
Okay.
which is a growing field that's attracting a lot of attention from investors who want to align their finances with their values.
And what is impact investing?
Yeah, so impact investing is really fascinating, and it's a rapidly evolving area
Okay.
that offers tremendous potential for aligning our finances with our faith. It's about intentionally seeking out investments
Okay.
that generate both financial returns and measurable social or environmental impact.
So you can actually make money
Yes.
and do good at the same time.
Exactly. And I think that's the beauty of impact investing, is that it breaks down this false dichotomy between, profit and purpose.
Okay.
It says that we can actually pursue both.
Can you give us some concrete examples
Sure.
of what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So imagine investing in a company that provides affordable housing in underserved communities, or a fund that supports renewable energy projects in developing countries.
Okay.
These are investments that not only generate financial returns, but also address these critical social and environmental challenges that we're facing.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
But isn't measuring impact a very complex and often subjective endeavor?
It can be, yeah. You're right to point that out. And the impact investing field is still relatively young,
Okay.
and standardized impact measurement methodologies are still evolving. But many impact investing funds and social enterprises are really committed to transparency and accountability.
Okay.
They're reporting on specific metrics that demonstrate the social and environmental impact of their activities.
So it's not just about taking their word for it.
Right.
There are actually metrics being used
Exactly.
to assess the impact.
Yeah. So, for example, a fund that's focused on clean energy might track metrics like the amount of carbon emissions reduced, the number of households provided with renewable energy.
Right.
A fund focused on affordable housing might track the number of units built, the number of families housed.
So it seems like transparency and accountability are really key
Absolutely.
when it comes to impact investing.
Yeah. And as investors, we have a responsibility to demand that transparency and to hold these funds and companies accountable for their impact claims.
So it's not just about passively investing, it's about actively engaging
Right.
and making sure our investments align with our values.
Absolutely. Impact investing isn't a set it and forget it approach.
Right.
It requires ongoing research, dialogue, a willingness to engage with the companies and funds that we support.
This has been such an enlightening conversation
Yeah, it's been great.
about the complexities and opportunities of ethical and impact investing.
Yeah.
Psychic Stocks. Belief shapes finance.